Act like you love me." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. They were barely a whisper, pressed into the narrow space between her lips and the wool of his shoulder, close enough that the warmth of her breath dampened the fabric. She could feel his entire body go still, not the stillness of shock or surprise or offense, the stillness of something much more dangerous, the stillness of a man who had been waiting. "For 5 minutes," she added, because the silence was filling with something she could not name, and she needed to put walls around it. Boundaries, a time limit, something to make this small and safe and survivable. "Just 5 minutes, please." His breathing changed. She felt it because her own lungs had already fallen into the rhythm of his, the way they always did when she stood this close, as though her body had forgotten how to breathe on its own and needed his chest to set the pace. It was the thing she never spoke about, the pull that made her inhale when he inhaled, exhale when he exhaled, so that in moments like this one, they became a single set of lungs sharing the same air. Halston Brackenmoor, Alpha King of the River Territories, the man she had spent 2 years trying not to look at, turned his head just enough that his mouth was beside her ear. 5 minutes, he repeated. His voice was low and steady and gave nothing away. But his hand came up, and his fingers closed around hers, and the grip was not gentle. It was not the grip of a man performing. It was the grip of a man who had no intention of letting go. She should have known then. She should have understood what she had done, what door she had opened, what 5 minutes would cost her. But the emissary from her birth pack was walking through the doors of the great hall, and his boots were loud on the stone floor, and Cecily Northcott had run out of time to think. 2 years earlier, she had arrived at Brackenmoor Manor with nothing. That was not an exaggeration or the kind of poetic self-pity that makes a story sound more tragic than it is. She had arrived with nothing. No trunk, no letter of introduction, no companion, no name that anyone in the River Territories would have recognized or cared about. She had been delivered by 2 guards from her birth pack, the Northcott wolves of the Eastern Fells, and the guards had not spoken to her for the entirety of the 3-day journey. They had spoken about her, to each other, in front of her, as though she were cargo with ears. "She will be housed but not confined," one of them had said, reading from a letter. "She is a ward of the Crown, not a prisoner. The distinction matters for the treaty." The distinction had not, in practice, mattered at all. A ward of the Crown lived in a small chamber on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. A ward of the Crown ate in the secondary hall, with the minor household staff not in the great hall with the court. A ward of the Crown was given 2 dresses, both in dark teal wool with wide leather sashes, and a small obsidian pendant on a leather cord that marked her status the way a brand marks livestock. She was not locked in. She was not chained. She was simply irrelevant, a political footnote, a living piece of treaty language that no one bothered to read. Her pack had sent her as insurance. If the Northcott wolves ever broke the terms of the territorial agreement, the Alpha King of the River Territories held their youngest daughter. It was an old practice and a brutal one, and her father had agreed to it the way he agreed to everything, with a handshake and a shrug and the unspoken understanding that some children are less valuable than others. Cecily had not argued. She had not wept. She had walked through the gates of Brackenmoor Manor, a stone estate built where 2 rivers converged, surrounded on 3 sides by water so dark it looked like ink, and she had looked up at the great hall with its vaulted windows and its ancient oak doors and thought, very quietly, "This is the rest of my life." She had been 19 years old. For the first 6 months, she did not speak to anyone who did not speak to her first. She walked the grounds. She sat in the library, which was vast and warm and smelled of leather and candle wax, and she read everything she could find. She memorized the rhythms of the household. When the kitchens opened, when the guards changed, when the court gathered, when the king emerged from his private study and walked the stone corridor that connected the east wing to the great hall. She learned his schedule before she ever learned his face. The first time she saw Halston Brackenmoor, she was sitting on a bench in the south garden, reading a book about the migratory patterns of river birds, and he walked past her without stopping. He was taller than she expected, broader. His hair was medium brown, falling in loose waves to his collar, and he wore a dark charcoal coat with obsidian clasps and a fur mantle over one shoulder that made him look like something carved from the landscape itself. His circlet caught the late afternoon light, iron set with obsidian, and the shadow it cast across his brow made his green eyes darker than they were. He did not look at her. She told herself she was relieved. For the next 3 months, this became a pattern. He walked. She watched. She learned the cadence of his stride, the set of his jaw when he was thinking, the way he paused at the junction of the east corridor and turned his head slightly to the left, as though listening for something no one else could hear. She learned that he carried tension in his shoulders and released it only when he was near the river. She learned that the household staff respected him, but did not cower. She learned that when he spoke, people listened not because they were afraid, but because he chose his words, the way a mason chooses stones, placing each one with purpose. She learned all of this from a distance. She was very good at distance. The first time he spoke to her was an accident. She had been in the library, reaching for a volume on the highest shelf, standing on the tips of her toes with her fingers barely grazing the spine, when his hand appeared above hers and pulled the book free. She stumbled backward. He caught her elbow, and for 3 full seconds they stood in the warm amber light of the library, his hand on her arm. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs, and the air between them did something impossible. Their breathing synchronized. She felt it happen. One moment her chest was tight and arrhythmic with surprise. The next, her lungs expanded in perfect time with his, as though someone had tuned 2 instruments to the same pitch. Inhale, exhale, inhale. The rhythm was deep and slow and steady, and it was not hers. He let go of her arm. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was lower up close, quieter. "Thank you," she said, taking the book. Her hands were shaking. He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes moved across her face with an attention that felt physical, like fingertips tracing the line of her jaw. She saw the moment he noticed the obsidian pendant at her throat, the ward's marker, and she saw something shift behind his expression. Not pity, not dismissal. Something careful and complicated that she could not read. "You are the Northcott ward," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He nodded once, then he turned and left. That night, lying in her narrow bed with the book unopened on her chest, Cecily pressed her hand flat against her sternum and tried to find her own breathing rhythm, the one that belonged to her, the one she had used for 19 years before today. It took her an hour. After the library, things changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone else in the household would have noticed, but Cecily noticed because noticing was the only skill she had, and what she noticed was this. Halston Brackenmoor had started pausing at the junction of the east corridor and turning his head to the left, not because he was listening for something, but because her chamber was to the left, and he was checking whether she was there. She could not prove this. She had no evidence beyond the angle of his chin and the half-second delay before he continued walking. But she knew it the way she knew when rain was coming, in the pressure behind her eyes and the tightness in her chest, and the way her breathing went shallow and searching, reaching for a rhythm that was not in the room. Small encounters accumulated like snowfall. He appeared in the library when she was there, browsing shelves he had clearly already browsed, pulling volumes he did not read. He walked the south garden at precisely the hour she sat on her bench. He attended the secondary hall for a meal one evening, ostensibly to speak with the head cook about provisions, and sat 3 seats away from her and did not look at her once, and she felt his breathing the entire time, steady and sure, pulling hers into alignment like a current, pulling a leaf downstream. Neither of them acknowledged it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, and the rivers swelled so high that the lower garden flooded and the household scrambled to move supplies from the ground floor storerooms. Cecily had been walking the east corridor when the rain began, and she stopped at the window to watch the water rise, and she did not hear him approach until his reflection appeared in the glass beside hers. "You should not stand near the windows during storms," he said. "The shutters on this wing are old. They do not hold well." "I like the sound," she said, and then felt foolish because it was such a small and private thing to admit to a king. But he did not look at her like it was small. He looked at her like she had handed him something valuable and breakable, and he said, "So do I." And they stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the rain hammer the dark water and listening to the thunder roll across the valley, and their breathing was so perfectly matched that the rise and fall of their chests moved like a single wave. When the storm passed, he walked her to the junction of the east corridor and paused there, as he always did, and this time he turned not just his head but his whole body toward her, and for one breathless moment she thought he was going to say something that would change the shape of everything between them. Instead, he said, "Good night, Ward." The word landed wrong. She heard it, and he heard it, the clinical distance of it, the reminder of what she was and what he was, and the treaty that sat between them like a wall made of paper. "Good night, Your Majesty," she replied, and the formality tasted bitter in her mouth, and she walked to her chamber and closed the door and leaned against it and listened to the sound of his footsteps retreating down the corridor, each one slower than the last. 3 days later, she found a book on her bench in the south garden. It was a volume about storms, about the patterns of weather across river valleys, about the way thunder moves through water differently than through air. There was no note, there was no inscription. But the spine was uncreased, which meant it was new, and there was only one person in Brackenmoor who would have known to leave it there. She read it in a single afternoon, and the next morning, when he paused at the junction, she was standing in the corridor with the book in her hands. "The chapter on river acoustics was wrong," she said. "The author confuses resonance with refraction. They are not the same phenomenon." He blinked. Then, slowly, the corners of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough. "I will have the bookseller notified," he said. She almost laughed. She caught it behind her teeth and held it there, and he saw her holding it, and his almost smile deepened, and something warm and terrifying bloomed between them in the cold stone corridor, something that had no name and no boundary and no expiration date. She began to wonder if she was imagining things. If the breath pull was something she had invented, a phantom sensation born from loneliness and too many hours in a library reading about mate bonds she would never have. She was a political ward. She was a Northcott, and the Northcotts were border wolves with no standing and no alliances and no future beyond whatever scraps the larger packs left them. She was not the kind of woman that an alpha king noticed. She was the kind of woman that happened to be in the room. Then he gave her the cloak. It arrived without explanation, folded on her bed one afternoon, a heavy wool cloak lined with dark fur and clasped with an obsidian brooch in the shape of a river stone. It was not teal. It was not the colour of a ward. It was deep charcoal, almost black, and it was the warmest thing she had ever touched. And when she put it on and walked to the south garden that evening, Halston Brackenmoor saw her from across the courtyard, and the corners of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to make her heart stutter. She wore the cloak every day after that. She wore it when the autumn deepened, and the rivers ran cold, and the trees along the banks turned amber and rust. She wore it when the first frost came and the stone corridors of Brackenmoor Manor held the chill like a jar holds water. She wore it the evening Catherine found her sitting on the bench in the south garden with her knees drawn up and her face buried in the wool. "You look like you are trying to disappear into that cloak," Catherine said. She was the other ward at Brackenmoor, a young woman from the Ashwick pack who had been here for 4 years and who had the kind of pragmatic warmth that comes from surviving without bitterness. She had befriended Cecily in the second week, appearing at her table in the secondary hall with a bowl of soup and the blunt announcement, "I am the only other person here who understands what the obsidian pendant means, so we might as well eat together." "I am not disappearing," Cecily said. "I am thinking." "You are smelling that cloak," Catherine said, sitting beside her. "Do not pretend you are not. You have been wearing it for 3 weeks and your face goes soft every time you pull the collar up. It smells like him, does it not?" Cecily said nothing. "Cecily." "It smells like pine," Cecily said carefully, "and river water, and something warm, like embers." "That is what he smells like," Catherine said. "I have been here for 4 years, I know his scent, and you are sitting in a garden in the dark, breathing it in like it is keeping you alive. You are being dramatic." "You are being careful," Catherine corrected, "which is smart, but you should know that he has never given anyone a cloak before, not a courtier, not a guest, not anyone. The household has been talking about it for days." Cecily pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders and said nothing, and the silence lasted long enough that Catherine sighed and leaned against her, and they sat together in the cold, dark garden, 2 wards with obsidian pendants, and listened to the rivers. 14 months into her wardship, Cecily began to accept that she was in love with a man who had spoken to her exactly 11 times. She had counted 11 conversations, most of them brief, all of them in the library, or the corridor, or the garden, all of them marked by the same pattern. He would say something careful and precise. She would respond with something careful and shorter, and then they would both stand there breathing in unison while the silence between them filled with everything they were not saying. She did not know if what she felt was a mate bond. She had read about bonds in the library, clinical accounts in old texts, and the descriptions were varied and contradictory. Some said mate bonds announced themselves with a flash of heat. Others described a slow recognition, like a song you have known your whole life finally being played aloud. Others said the bond was simply a knowing, an absolute certainty that settled into the bones and could not be argued with. What Cecily felt was breathing. She felt his breath in her lungs when he was close. She felt the absence of it when he was far away. She felt her chest expand when he entered a room and contract when he left. She felt the rhythm of him in her sleep, a phantom pulse that was not her heartbeat, but kept time with her heartbeat, and in the mornings she woke gasping, not from nightmares, but from the sudden loss of synchronization, as though her body was reaching for a signal that had gone out of range. She did not tell him. She did not tell him because she was a ward, because she was a Northcott, because her pack had sent her as insurance, not as a bride, and the treaty that kept her here was the same treaty that kept her pack from losing their territory, and if anyone at all, suspected that the Alpha King's ward had developed feelings for the Alpha King, the political implications would be catastrophic. Her father would see it as leverage. His council would see it as manipulation. And Halston, who carried the weight of 3 territories on his shoulders and who chose every word like a mason choosing stones, would be forced to make a decision that no king should have to make between his duty and his ward. So she kept her distance. She sat on her bench and read her books and wore his cloak and breathed his borrowed air and told herself that this was enough. That loving someone from 11 conversations and a synchronized heartbeat was its own kind of fullness. That the ache in her chest when he paused at the junction and turned his head to the left was not loneliness but gratitude, because at least he paused. And then the letter arrived. It came on a cold morning in the 2nd year. Catherine brought it to her room, white-faced and trembling, and handed it to Cecily without a word. The seal was the Northcott wolf. The handwriting was her father's. "Your brother has been named heir," Catherine said quietly. "They are recalling you." Cecily read the letter. The words were precise and unemotional. Her father had sired a son with his new mate, a legitimate male heir. Cecily's value as insurance was no longer sufficient to justify the political cost of maintaining her wardship. An emissary would be sent to Brackenmoor to negotiate her return. She was to prepare herself for the journey and to conduct herself with dignity. She was, the letter concluded, to remember where she belonged. "They cannot force you to go," Catherine said. "Can they? The treaty, the terms of the wardship." "The wardship was voluntary," Cecily said. Her voice sounded very far away. "My father offered it. He can withdraw the offer." "But the king? If the king refused to release you—" "Why would he refuse?" Cecily folded the letter with steady hands. "I am a political formality. The treaty stands with or without me. There is no reason for the king to involve himself." Catherine stared at her. "Cecily, the cloak." "Is a cloak," Cecily said. "People give cloaks. It does not mean anything." But that night she lay in her bed with the cloak pulled over her like a blanket, and she breathed and her lungs searched for a rhythm that was 2 floors below and a corridor away, and she understood with a clarity that felt like falling that she was about to lose the only home she had ever chosen. She had 2 weeks before the emissary arrived. The 2 weeks passed the way time always passes when you are losing something, too fast and too slow at once. Every day she sat on her bench. Every day she wore his cloak. Every day she watched the corridor junction and saw him pause and turn his head and continue walking, and each pause felt like a door being held open by someone who did not know they were about to close it forever. She tried to memorize things. The exact pattern of light on the library floor at 3 in the afternoon, the sound of the rivers at dawn when the current was strongest and the water ran loud against the stone foundations, the scent of the south garden in early frost, the precise shade of green in his eyes when the sun hit them through the corridor window. She was building a palace of memory to live in after they took her from the real one. On the 10th day, she found him in the corridor at an unusual hour. He was standing at the junction, but he was not pausing on his way somewhere. He was standing still, waiting. His hands were at his sides, and his jaw was tight, and his breathing was unsteady. And when he saw her come around the corner, something in his expression cracked open and was immediately sealed shut again. "I have read the letter," he said. She stopped. "How?" "Broderick Hallow sent a copy of the petition ahead of his arrival. I have had it for 3 days." 3 days. He had known for 3 days, and he had said nothing. He had walked the corridor and paused at the junction and continued on, and all the while he had been carrying the knowledge that she was leaving. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I was trying to find a legal basis to refuse the petition, and I could not, and I did not want to tell you I had failed until I had exhausted every option." The words settled between them. She looked at his face and saw the truth of it, the tension around his eyes and the set of his mouth and the slight, barely perceptible tremor in the hand closest to her, and she understood something she had been too afraid to understand. This was costing him too. She walked away before she could say something that would make it worse. She walked to her chamber and closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat against her sternum and felt the familiar, desperate searching of her lungs for a rhythm that was not in the room. The emissary's name was Broderick Hallow. Cecily knew him by reputation. He was her father's second, a red-brown-haired man with sharp features and grey eyes that missed nothing, who wore a dark navy military coat with brass buttons and carried himself with the rigid precision of someone who believed that discipline was the highest form of respect. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was efficient, which was worse, because efficiency left no room for argument. He arrived at Brackenmoor Manor with an escort of 4 guards and a formal petition for Cecily's release, and he presented it to Halston in the great hall in front of the assembled court, and Cecily stood at the back of the room with her hands clasped in front of her, and her obsidian pendant heavy against her chest, and her breathing ragged and disorganized because the hall was large and the king was far away and she could not find his rhythm. The Northcott pack extends its gratitude to the River Crown for sheltering its daughter, Broderick said. His voice carried. With the birth of a male heir, the wardship is no longer necessary. We request the release of Cecily Northcott to return to her birth territory. The court murmured. Cecily could feel their eyes on her, the same eyes that had not looked at her for 2 years, suddenly remembering that she existed. Halston sat in the high seat at the front of the hall. His face was unreadable. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, and his breathing was slow and even, and Cecily could feel it from across the room, steady as a tide, and her own lungs were trying to match it, but the distance was too great, and her chest ached with the effort. The wardship terms are documented, Halston said. The Northcott ward was placed in the care of the River Crown for the duration of the treaty. The treaty has not concluded. The treaty remains in force regardless of the wardship, Broderick replied smoothly. The ward was offered as a gesture of good faith. With the heir established, the gesture is complete. The Northcott pack respectfully requests its daughter's return. The word daughter landed like a stone in still water. Cecily saw several courtiers glance at her. She kept her face neutral. I will consider the petition, Halston said. The emissary is welcome to remain at Brackenmoor while I review the terms. It was a delay, a small one, but it was something. After the court dispersed, Cecily walked to the south garden and sat on her bench and pressed her face into the fur collar of her cloak and tried to think. She had 2 days, maybe 3, before Halston issued his decision. There was no legal basis for him to refuse. The treaty was clear. The wardship was a courtesy, not a condition, and now that her father had an heir, the courtesy had expired. She would be sent home, where she was not a ward with an obsidian pendant, but a spare daughter with no purpose. Home, where her father would find another use for her, another alliance, another treaty, another handshake. Home, where no one paused at the junction of a corridor and turned their head to the left just to know she was there. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her breathing stutter. The thought came unbidden, terrible, and precise. There is one way to stay. If she were claimed. If the Alpha King had a formal attachment to her, no emissary could petition for her return. A claimed mate was not a ward. A claimed mate had rights, standing, a position that could not be dissolved by a father's letter. But she was not his mate. She was his ward. She was a Northcott girl with an obsidian pendant and 11 conversations and a cloak that smelled like pine. Unless she asked. Unless she found him alone and looked him in the eye and asked him to pretend. Not forever. Not even for a day, just long enough to convince an emissary, just long enough to make the claim look real. 5 minutes. That was all she needed. 5 minutes of his hand on hers, and his body angled toward her, and his voice saying words that sounded like they meant something. 5 minutes to make Broderick Hallow believe that the Alpha King had a reason to keep her. It was manipulative, it was desperate. It was the only plan she had. She found him in the library. He was standing at the window, looking out at the confluence of the 2 rivers, and the late afternoon light turned his brown hair amber at the edges and caught the obsidian in his circlet and made his profile look like something from a very old painting. His coat was unbuttoned at the throat. His breathing was slow. Hers matched it immediately. The relief was so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. He turned. His green eyes found her face, and she saw the attention there, the careful focus that always made her feel like the only solid thing in a room full of shadows. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She crossed the room. She stopped 2 paces from him, which was too far to touch and too close to think, and she clasped her hands in front of her and said, "The emissary will take me in 2 days. You have no legal grounds to refuse. The wardship terms are clear. My father's petition is valid. You know this." "I know this," he said. "There is one circumstance under which you could refuse, if I were claimed, if there were a formal attachment." He said nothing. His breathing did not change. "I am asking you," she said, and her voice did crack now, just barely, just enough to hear, "to pretend, in front of the emissary, in front of the court. I am asking you to stand beside me and hold my hand and let people believe that I am more than a ward to you. I know what it costs. I know what it looks like. I know what your counsel will say. But I cannot go back there, Halston. I cannot." She had never used his name before. Not out loud. It tasted like a confession. He watched her. The silence stretched. "For how long?" he asked. The question was so quiet she almost missed it. She swallowed hard. 5 minutes, she whispered. She took the last step. She put her hand on his arm on the dark wool of his coat, and she felt the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric and her lungs filled with his rhythm, and she pressed her mouth close to his shoulder and said it again, because once was not enough. "Act like you love me, for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Please." He was still for a long time. The light in the library shifted from amber to gold. The rivers murmured below the window. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his coat, or maybe it was her heartbeat, because they were breathing in perfect time and the boundary between them had grown very, very thin. 5 minutes, he repeated. His voice was rough. Then his hand came up and his fingers closed around hers, and the grip was not gentle, and Cecily understood that she had just made a terrible mistake, because 5 minutes with Halston Brackenmoor holding her hand, like he meant it was going to ruin her for everything that came after. The performance began at dinner. Halston appeared in the great hall that evening with Cecily on his arm, and the court went silent so quickly that she could hear the candles guttering in the iron chandeliers. Every eye in the room tracked the placement of his hand on the small of her back, the angle of his body toward hers, the way he pulled her chair out beside his at the high table, a seat that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. The whispers began before she sat down. She heard fragments of them, carried on the warm air of the hall. The ward, and Northcott girl, and since when, and, from somewhere near the back, a single sharp inhale of surprise that was louder than any word. Broderick Hallow, seated at the diplomatic table, looked up from his plate and went very still. Cecily's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs under the table and willed them to stop, and they did not stop, and the great hall felt enormous, and she felt small, and the obsidian pendant was a cold weight against her chest, reminding her of what she was. "Breathe," Halston murmured beside her, and she realized she had stopped. Her lungs had locked. She forced herself to inhale, and the moment she did, his rhythm caught her, steady and deep, and her chest expanded, and the panic eased, and she was breathing again, breathing with him, and the relief was so total that her hand found his under the table and held on. He did not pull away. He laced his fingers through hers and rested their joined hands on his thigh, hidden by the tablecloth, and when the first course was served, He leaned toward her and said something about the fish that was not interesting or important, but was spoken in a low, warm voice that carried just far enough for the nearest courtiers to hear and mistake for intimacy. She laughed. It was not a performance. The fish comment was genuinely funny, a dry observation about the cook's ongoing feud with the river trout, and the surprise of humour from a man she had only ever seen be serious made her laugh before she could stop it, and the sound was bright and real and entirely wrong for a woman who was supposed to be pretending. His eyes changed when she laughed. The careful reserve shifted. Something warmer surfaced, something that had been waiting beneath the composure, and he looked at her mouth, and then away, quickly, as though he had seen something he was not supposed to see. Across the hall, Broderick set down his cup. He was watching them with the careful focus of a man cataloguing evidence. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then the entire dinner. He held her hand through all of it. He refilled her cup. He told her about the river birds she had been reading about in the library, and she realized he had seen the book on her bench weeks ago and remembered the title and had apparently gone and read it himself, because he quoted a passage about the nesting habits of the grey heron with an accuracy that made her stare. "You read my book," she said. "I read the library's book," he corrected. "You happened to read it first." "You read it because I read it." He did not deny it. His thumb traced a circle on the back of her hand under the table. She became aware, slowly, of the way the hall had adjusted to their proximity. The whispers had not stopped, but they had changed in texture. The sharp surprise of the first minutes had given way to something more speculative, more uncertain. She caught courtiers glancing at the high table with expressions that were not scandalized but curious, as though they were watching a piece of the world rearrange itself and were trying to decide how they felt about the new shape. Katrin, seated at the far end of the secondary tables, caught Cecily's eye and raised both eyebrows so high they disappeared behind her hairline. Her expression said, "What are you doing?" And also, "About time." When the meal ended, Halston stood and offered Cecily his hand. In front of the entire court, in front of Broderick Hallow and the 4 guards and every minor lord and household member who had spent 2 years looking through her as though she were made of glass. He offered his hand the way a man offers his hand to a woman he values, palm up, steady, waiting for her to choose. She took it. He walked her to the East Wing corridor, and they stood at the junction, the exact spot where he had been pausing for 2 years, and the silence between them was dense and warm and terrifying. The stone walls held the quiet. The torchlight cast their shadows long across the floor, tangled together. 5 minutes are long over, she said. I am aware. You can stop now. He looked at her. The green of his eyes was very dark in the corridor light, and his breathing was perfectly synchronized with hers, and he said, "Can I?" It was not a rhetorical question, it was a real one. He was asking her whether she wanted him to stop. He was asking her to choose, to say the word, to draw the line, and she knew, standing there in the borrowed cloak he had given her with the obsidian pendant, cold against her collarbone, and his breath in her lungs, and his scent in every fibre of the wool around her shoulders, she knew that if she said stop, he would stop. He would step back. He would let Broderick Hallow take her home. He would stand in the great hall and watch her leave, and he would never say a word about the way their breathing matched, or the book about river birds, or the 11 conversations that had each been a small, careful brick in a wall that was shaped exactly like a home. "No," she said. "Do not stop." He exhaled. The sound was ragged, and he lifted his hand and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw the way his eyes had traced it in the library a year ago, and her breathing hitched and then steadied and then matched his again, and she leaned into his palm and closed her eyes. He did not kiss her. He pressed his forehead to hers and stood there, breathing with her, and it was more intimate than any kiss she had ever imagined. She could feel the warmth of his skin and the slow expansion of his chest and the way his scent wrapped around her, pine and river water and embers, and she thought, This is what I cannot survive losing. Not the manor, not the library, not the bench in the south garden. This, the sound of him breathing, the weight of his forehead against mine, the impossible, terrifying, certain knowledge that my lungs were made to move with his. The next morning, Broderick Hallow requested a private meeting with Cecily. She met him in the secondary hall, which was empty at that hour, and he stood with his hands behind his back and his brass buttons gleaming and his grey eyes flat and assessing. "This is a performance," he said. It was not a question. "I do not know what you mean." "I have been watching the court for 2 days. There is no scent claim on you. There is no public declaration. There is no formal attachment on record. 2 days ago, you were a ward who ate in the secondary hall and wore the obsidian pendant. Last night, you sat at the high table. The timing is convenient." Cecily said nothing. "Your father's instructions are clear," Broderick continued. "I am to bring you home. If you are manipulating the king's sympathy to avoid your obligations to your pack, you should understand that your father will not view this favourably." "My father has never viewed me favourably," Cecily said. Her voice was calm. "I was insurance. Now I am surplus. Whether I come home or stay here, I am the same thing to him, a piece of treaty language that is no longer being read." Something flickered in Broderick's expression. Not sympathy, precisely. Recognition. The look of a man who has served a master long enough to know the shape of the master's cruelty without calling it by name. "Be that as it may," he said. "The petition stands. The king has no grounds to refuse it unless there is a legitimate claim, and you and I both know there is not." He left her there in the empty hall. Cecily sat down at the table where she had eaten every meal for 2 years and put her face in her hands and breathed, and her lungs searched for Halston's rhythm and could not find it, and the air in the room felt thin and wrong and insufficient. 5 minutes. She had asked for 5 minutes. And now she was going to lose everything because 5 minutes was not enough to build a claim on, and Broderick Hallow had seen through the performance, and she was going home to a father who had traded her like grain and a pack that had forgotten her name. The worst part was not the fear of going home. The worst part was the guilt. She had used Halston. She had walked into his library and asked him to perform an emotion for her benefit, and he had done it, without hesitation, without even asking what she would give him in return, and now his court was whispering, and his emissary was suspicious, and his political position was compromised because a ward with an obsidian pendant had been too desperate to consider the cost. She pressed her hand to her chest. Her breathing was shallow and stuttering. She thought, "I cannot do this. I cannot stand in front of the court and pretend that last night was pretending. I cannot hold his hand and then let it go. I cannot go back to breathing alone." But underneath the panic, quieter and more dangerous, was the thought she had been refusing to acknowledge for months. What if it was not pretending? What if his hand on hers was not generous? What if the books and the cloak and the pauses at the junction were not the courtesies of a responsible king toward a member of his household? What if the breath synchronization was not a physiological anomaly? What if the reason her lungs could not find their rhythm without him was the same reason his almost smile appeared only when she was in the room? She sat in the secondary hall for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The kitchen staff came and went, setting up for the evening meal, and none of them looked at her because none of them had ever looked at her because wards were furniture, wards were political punctuation, wards were the kind of people you walked past without pausing. Catherine found her there. She sat down across the table without speaking and waited, the way only someone who has also been a ward knows how to wait with patience that is not passive but practiced. "Broderick knows," Cecily said. "I know. He will take me tomorrow. There is nothing to stop him." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "When you asked the king to pretend, did it feel like pretending?" "No." "Did it feel like pretending to him?" Cecily said nothing. "Then stop treating it like a strategy that failed," Catherine said gently, "and go tell him the truth." That evening she went to the library. She did not know if he would be there. She went anyway, because the library smelled like leather and candle wax and the faintest trace of pine, and it was the closest thing to his presence she could find without seeking him out. He was there. He was sitting in the chair by the window, and there was a book open on his knee, but he was not reading. He was looking at the door. He was waiting for her. "Broderick knows," she said. "He called it a performance. He said there is no scent claim, no formal attachment. He is right." Halston closed the book. He set it on the table beside the chair. He looked at her with those green eyes that carried too much in their depths, and his breathing was steady, and hers was not. "Do you want to know something?" he said. She waited. "I have been pausing at the junction of the East Corridor every morning for 22 months. I told myself it was a habit. Then I told myself it was concern for a member of my household. Then I told myself it was the breathing, that the synchronization was a physiological anomaly, and I was monitoring it out of caution." He paused. "I ran out of excuses 8 months ago." The room was very quiet. "The cloak was not a courtesy," he said. "It was the closest I could come to putting my arms around you without crossing a line that I was not sure you wanted crossed. I had it commissioned from the same woman who makes my own cloaks. I chose the fur. I chose the brooch. I stood in the weaver's shop and told her the measurements, and she asked me who it was for, and I said, 'Someone who is cold.' And that was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. And the whole truth was that I could not bear the thought of you walking through the south garden in the autumn wind, in a ward's dress with nothing between you and the cold." Cecily's breathing broke and rebuilt itself in the space of a single heartbeat. Her eyes were burning. She blinked, and she did not look away, and he did not look away. "The books," he continued, and his voice had the quality of a man who has opened a door he had been leaning against for a very long time and cannot close it again. "Every book I left on your bench, every volume I read because I saw it in your hands, every conversation about river birds and storm acoustics and the nesting patterns of herons, those were not the interests of a responsible king. Those were the excuses of a man who wanted to know you and could not find a way to say so. When you came to me yesterday and asked me to act like I loved you," he said, and his voice was not steady now, not careful, not measured. "I did not have to act. I have not had to act since the day I pulled a book off a shelf and caught your arm and my lungs forgot that they had ever breathed without yours." She crossed the room. She did not remember deciding to move. One moment she was in the doorway, and the next she was standing in front of his chair, and his hands were on her waist and her hands were on his shoulders, and they were breathing together, perfectly synchronized, inhale and exhale and inhale, and the rhythm was so deep and so steady and so completely shared that she could not tell where her breath ended and his began. He kissed her. It was slow and deliberate, and it tasted like every careful word he had ever said to her, every pause at the junction, every book read, because she read it first. It tasted like pine and river water, and 22 months of waiting, and when he pulled back, just far enough to see her face, her eyes were bright, and her cheeks were flushed, and she was smiling for the first time in 2 years. 5 minutes, she whispered. "I only asked for 5 minutes." "I know," he said. "I was never going to stop at 5. The next morning, Broderick Hallow convened the court. He stood in the centre of the great hall, with his petition in his hand and his grey eyes scanning the room, and he said, in a voice that carried to every corner, "I call upon the Alpha King to release the ward Cecily Northcott to the custody of her birth pack, as stipulated by the expiration of the wardship terms. If there is a legitimate claim that supersedes the petition, let it be stated now." The court waited. Halston sat in the high seat. Cecily stood at his right, which was the position of a mate, not a ward, and her hand was in his, and their breathing was synchronized, and the entire room could feel the weight of whatever was happening between them. Halston looked at Cecily. "This should be your words," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "Not mine." She understood. If he spoke for her, she would be a ward defended by a king. If she spoke for herself, she would be a woman choosing her own life. She let go of his hand. She stepped forward. The distance between the high seat and the centre of the hall was 12 paces. She had counted them once, on one of the evenings she had watched from the back of the room during formal proceedings, invisible and uncounted. She had stood against the wall with the other wards and servants and thought, "That floor is not mine. That centre is not mine. I have no voice in this room. 12 paces. She covered them now. "My wardship at Brackenmoor was offered by my father as a condition of a treaty," she said. Her voice carried. It did not shake. "I did not choose it. I was not consulted. I was sent here the way one sends a letter, sealed and delivered and expected to remain where I was placed." The court was silent. Broderick's expression was unreadable. "For 2 years I have lived in this household. I have eaten in the secondary hall. I have worn the obsidian pendant. I have been a political footnote. And in that time, I have come to understand something about myself that my birth pack never allowed me to discover. I am not a piece of treaty language. I am not insurance. I am not surplus." She lifted the obsidian pendant from her chest and pulled it over her head. The leather cord caught on her braids, and she freed it with steady hands, and she held the pendant in her palm. The ward's marker, the brand, the stone that had sat against her skin for 2 years and left a faint impression on her collarbone, like a shadow that refused to fade. The hall was so quiet she could hear the rivers through the walls. "I remove my own wardship," she said. "I am no longer a ward of the River Crown. I am not property to be petitioned for, and I am not going home with you, Broderick, not because the king refuses to release me, because I refuse to leave." The court erupted. Voices layered on top of each other, some sharp with disapproval, others low with surprise, and somewhere in the noise, Cecily heard Catherine make a sound that was either a laugh or a sob, and might have been both. Broderick's jaw tightened. His grey eyes moved from Cecily to Halston and back, calculating, assessing. "You have no standing to refuse," Broderick said, and his voice was steady, but his scent had changed, taking on the acrid edge of a man whose plan was being dismantled in front of witnesses. "Without the wardship, you have no legal status here at all. You are a Northcott. You belong to the Northcott pack." "She belongs to no one." Halston's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. He had not risen from the high seat. He did not need to. Every wolf in the room felt the weight of his voice, the authority behind it, and the hall went silent. Cecily felt his breathing reach for hers across the room, and even at this distance, even with 12 paces and a court full of people between them, her lungs answered. Steady. Sure. Synchronized. "But if she chooses to stay," he continued, "she stays under the protection of the River Crown, not as a ward, not as a political condition, as a member of my household, with full rights and full standing for as long as she wishes." Broderick's nostrils flared. Her father will not accept this. Her father. Halston said, and his voice was quiet now but carried in the way that only a king's voice carries, with the weight of stone and iron and the absolute certainty of a man who has made his decision and will not revisit it, sent his youngest daughter to a foreign court as insurance and then tried to recall her when she was no longer useful. I do not particularly care what her father accepts. The words landed like stones. The court murmured. Several of the older wolves exchanged glances, and Cecily saw approval in some of their faces and calculation in others, but what she felt most of all was the rhythm of Halston's breathing behind her, steady and sure and perfectly aligned with hers, and the realization that he was not performing for the court. He was not making a political statement. He was simply saying what was true. Broderick looked at her. For a long moment the emissary studied her face, and she saw the recognition again, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who understood the shape of her father's cruelty and had served it anyway. She thought she saw something else there too, something that might have been relief, as though a part of Broderick Hallow, the part that was not an emissary but a man, was glad that at least one of the Northcott children had found a way out. "I will convey your decision to your father," he said at last. His voice was neutral. "The petition is withdrawn." He bowed. He turned. He walked out of the great hall, and his boots were loud on the stone floor, and the sound faded, and the doors closed, and Cecily stood in the centre of the room with the obsidian pendant in her hand, and the ward's marker finally, irrevocably gone. The silence after the doors closed was different from the silence before Broderick spoke. The first had been anticipatory. This one was something else. This one had weight and warmth and the texture of a world reordering itself around a new truth. Halston rose from the high seat. He crossed the hall. The court parted for him the way water parts for stone, and she watched him come. This man who had given her a cloak and read her books, and paused at a corridor junction for 22 months, and her breathing was so steady and so deep and so completely in rhythm with his that the 12 paces he crossed felt like they took no time at all, as though the distance between them had never been anything more than a formality that both of them had been too careful to breach. He reached her and stopped, and he looked at her with green eyes that held nothing careful and nothing reserved and nothing hidden, and he said, "You did not need me." "No," she agreed. "But I want you. That is better." His hand found hers, their fingers laced. The court was watching, and Cecily did not care, because his breathing was in her lungs, and her breathing was in his, and the rhythm they shared was not borrowed or temporary or conditional, and when he leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, the way he had done in the corridor, the hall fell silent and the candles burned steady and the rivers beyond the walls kept moving, carrying everything forward. That night, in the library, he asked her to stay properly, not as a household member, not as a political arrangement, as his mate, his equal, his queen, if she would have the title, though he made it clear that the title was optional, and the offer was not contingent on ceremony or formality or anything other than the simple fact that he had been breathing with her for 2 years, and he did not want to breathe alone again. She said yes. She said yes, and he kissed her, and the kiss was different from the first one. Deeper, less careful. The restraint he had carried for 22 months thinned, and she felt it in the press of his mouth and the grip of his hands, and the way his scent surrounded her, pine and river water, and something warm like embers, and when he finally pulled back, his breathing was ragged and uneven for the first time since she had known him. She had broken his rhythm. He did not seem to mind. 8 months later, on a morning in early spring, the rivers around Brackenmoor Manor ran high and clear and caught the new sunlight like something made of glass. Cecily sat in the south garden on the same bench where she had spent 2 years reading about river birds and pretending she was not waiting for a man to walk past. She was still reading because some things did not change, and the book in her lap was a new volume on the breeding patterns of the grey heron that Hulston had ordered from a bookseller in the capital because she had mentioned once that the library's copy was outdated. The garden was different now, not in any structural way. The same stone paths wound between the same beds of winter jasmine and early crocus. The same view stretched toward the confluence of the two rivers. But the bench had been moved slightly, just enough that it no longer faced the corridor window where she used to watch for him, but instead faced the river, because she no longer needed to watch for him. He came. He always came. The household had adjusted too. She ate in the great hall now, beside him, and the courtiers had absorbed her presence the way they absorbed anything the king chose, with deference that softened over time into something warmer. The head cook had started sending a second plate of honeyed bread to the high table because she had learned, somehow, that Cecily liked it. The librarian had begun ordering books on her behalf without being asked, volumes on ornithology and river ecology, and the migratory patterns of things that move through the world without leaving marks. Katrin still wore the obsidian pendant, but she wore it differently now, tucked inside her collar instead of displayed, and when Cecily had asked her why, she had said, "Because now I know it can come off." And that had been enough. Hulston appeared in the garden the way he always did, at precisely the hour she sat down, as though some internal clock had aligned itself to her schedule years ago and never bothered to reset. He sat beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, their breathing synchronized without effort, without thought, without the searching and reaching that had once marked her mornings, with a loneliness so specific it had its own shape. She leaned into him. The cloak she wore, dark charcoal with the obsidian brooch, was the same one he had given her in her first autumn. She wore it often, even now, even though her wardrobe had expanded considerably, and she had gowns and riding coats and a circlet of her own that sat in an obsidian-inlaid box on the dresser they shared. Around her neck, where the obsidian pendant had once hung, there was nothing. Just skin and collarbone, and the faint mark of the claiming bite he had placed there 4 months ago, which had healed into a thin, pale curve that she traced sometimes with her fingers, not out of vanity, but out of wonder. Out of the quiet, persistent amazement of a woman who had asked for 5 minutes and received a life. 5 minutes, she murmured, pressing her face into his shoulder the way she had done the very first time, when the word had been a plea and the number had been a boundary, and the whole desperate gamble had felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and hoping the wind would hold her. He turned his head. His mouth was beside her ear. His voice was low and warm and certain. "Still not stopping," he said. She laughed. The sound carried across the garden and scattered the herons from the riverbank and rang against the stone walls of Brackenmoor Manor, and it was bright, and it was real, and it was not a performance. It had never been a performance, not even for 5 minutes.